Dr. Longo, thanks for joining us. This has been a long time coming for our listeners, and you made quite a bunch of waves there a little while ago with your channel, and people are loving your work. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, man. Thanks, Graham. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, yeah. So you're like the Florida man, right? Well, actually, I shouldn't say the Florida man. That's pretty. That's- but let's. I mean, where do we want to start? Let's start like really like an overall kind of like picture of where your research has kind of led you, and then we can dig into some of the details from there. Like we like to talk about kind of Atlantean stuff and alternative history timelines, stuff like that. We had like Jason Brashears on and Randall Carlson, and like sort of a lot of younger Dryas type things. We do events with Randall Carlson, so we go around like looking at the stuff physically. Um, we love
Sure.
that kind of stuff, but you seem to even take it sort of a little bit further even. So
Well, I appreciate the setup with that. I always like to say American history, as we know it, North American, um, United States history, as we know it, begins in Florida. But what you're going to get is most history books start off with Virginia or one of the English colonies, and Florida usually gets swept under the rug. And I think there's a big reason to that. And whether it's Atlantis, whether it's who was here before Columbus, there's many different angles and why they would lie and why they have. But Florida was the first land that these world powers really sunk their teeth into in terms of the United States around 500 years ago. But
so like St. Augustine type thing when they officially kind of isn't that one of like the
sure.
oldest officially the oldest sort of areas where they came?
Yeah, St. Augustine is officially, there's a little bit of debate on that with a couple Florida cities, but the oldest continuous European settlement in the Americas. So, most first grade should kind of start there in my eyes, but it doesn't. And you get a lot of stories. A video I have coming out soon, for example, shows how not only was Florida being explored first, but stories from Florida were getting fully plagiarized and transmitted, transplanted onto Virginia, translated into English, and passed off as English feats.
Wow.
And the main example of that would be who's heard of Pocahontas, right? Pocahontas and John Smith, and later uh, Rolfe or whoever she got with after that. She had a husband, but before she was with John Smith, she saved him from slaughter. Right, that was in Virginia, the Powhatan territory. And this story goes that John Smith, the Englishman, was saved from certain death after being surrounded or captured by the Powhatan. And Pocahontas, this Indian princess, intervened, right? And this isn't something I focus on a ton, but like I said, there's a video coming out about it because it has to do with hurricanes, and this is one of the origins of these hurricane myths in Florida. But the way we're told it in Disney, and remember, anything that makes it into Disney is probably something to check twice on. You've got the very Chinese-looking Pocahontas in Virginia saving the English-speaking John Smith, whereas that actually never occurred. Simply did not. It is known that she married Pocahontas, the real Pocahontas, would have gotten with I forget his name, Dolph or Rolfe, I forget. But her second European love was the one she married and had a kid with. But John Smith, who she potentially saved, no, no, no. John Smith had heard that story around early 1600s after the DeSoto expedition had came back and made the rounds. The word of it made rounds throughout Europe, and the English started plagiarizing stories straight out of it. And one of the key ones was that Pocahontas myth. So they took a prominent Native woman in Virginia, embellished the story with an even more impressive story that occurred in Florida. And you'll see where this came from, where the true occurrence was Juan Ortiz being saved at the hands of Princess Eulalie, daughter of Hirahigua, which just might be where we get the word hurricane. And this was turned into the Pocahontas story. So that's just one example where the English were not only are they trying to hog American history, but they were plagiarizing it from Florida, where the Spanish had been.
I mean, I think
Sorry.
I know the answer, because it's the same reason why they're calling Graham Hancock a white supremacist. But why do they not want it to be true like that? Why not just give Florida the credit for all that?
Right. Well, not to go into the deep end too soon here, but it probably does point to something like Atlantis, or a more reasonable stepping stone to that conversation was who was here right before Columbus.
Yeah.
Who had Columbus just gotten done? Who had the people who were funding Columbus, the people whose ships he was sailing? Who had they just finished fighting in a series of wars for hundreds of years? The Moors of North Africa and Iberia. And these people were expelled right around the same time that Columbus left for the Americas. Columbus wasn't fitted for a spice trading. He was fitted for, expedition, conquest.
Right.
And that tells you something right there.
It was the blacks, and that's why there was a bunch of black slaves here. So we're thinking that those were the people that became the slaves instead, because it don't make sense to put black people back and forth on boats from Africa if you're gonna lose half of them. Cost a bunch of energy to do that when you had a bunch of Indians here that you could have done that with. Why not just use them? So it seems to be that there might have been some. I think it was Hotep Jesus we had on. I was talking about maybe some blacks in those West African currents sort of head right through the Caribbean and into Florida and all that.
Yeah, you've got the Gulf Stream, and I think you summed it up well, Darren. But you've got the Gulf Stream there, which is like a ancient. Well, it's not ancient. It always has been. There always will be. It's a warm water highway that goes around the Atlantic, and kind of the engine, what makes this thing circulate is the springs pumping out of Florida and the Mississippi depositing into the Gulf of Mexico. And this is considered kind of the amniotic fluids of the planet, because this Gulf Stream plays a very crucial role in many mythologies of the planet, and including the Finnish, which I, exalt as potentially the highest on the planet. Mythology, that is Finnish mythology, because from Finnish you get Phoenicians. So when you're up there in the Arctic Circle, you get Finnish people and Vikings. When you come down south, you get Phoenicians. Now they'll spell those two words with as many letters as they can differently for the average Joe not to realize they're the same. Phoenician with a P-H-O-E, Finnish with a F-I, right? Well, I'm not the first to figure that out. You have Connor McDarry, you have Michael Sarian, and blah, blah, blah. People were going across the Atlantic for hundreds of years, thousands of years. The Phoenicians, their predecessors, people who came after them, the Moors, the Irish, the Vikings. Mainstream is just in the last 20 years was acknowledging the Vikings came to the Americas, right? But every year we're seeing this where they're pushing the peopling of the Americas. That's something we can get into too, is why would they lie here? Well, here's probably a better answer to that. Well, they have our human history kind of pegged in this little sandbox out in an extremely contentious, politically charged zone that's been draining tax dollars, blood, resources for thousands of years. This is the Middle East I'm talking about. Now, do you think how maybe it's convenient to convince all the Abrahamic faiths that there is only a small little patch of territory that all of their stories occurred in. Therefore, all those religions could never fit inside that small land, so they'll always be contending it forever. This is why we have wars in the Middle East. This is all, it's not rich in resources. If it was, it's when they were irrigating the rivers to a high extent. And as soon as that stopped, it goes back to being what it is at its core, a barren wasteland. Now, when you tell someone, I'm not sure where you guys are at with, shape of where we live and stuff, but when you convince people that they live on something inanimate or something dead, a rock, a lifeless marble in the middle of nowhere, floating in nothingness, that does something to the subconscious, right? Likewise, when you instruct a group of well-meaning people, faithful people, that their origin is in perhaps the most desolate place in the world, that does something to them. That's the way I look at it. Now, when you look at the Americas, you have a lush paradise in many ways, not just in our resources, but in places like Florida. Truly, you could make the argument we have the best climate in the world. Places like Tampa Bay, it has never reached 100 degrees. Miami, it's only reached 100 degrees once in recorded history. That sounds like something that should be all over CNN and the news. And well, guess what? You know how many hundreds of people you'll have dying across the Midwest, Colorado? Why? Because it's going to hit 117 degrees in all of those states at least once this summer, right? That will kill someone dead in the street. Florida, however, heat stroke was unheard of before the 1920s, right? People, it was the land of health. People were living past 100, well past 100, long before they started studying Japan and the Mediterranean diet. Florida was known around the world as the place to be for health, whether it was the springs. Why would they lie? You have resources like the springs. You have the most desirable climate, territory, perhaps in the world. Just check the property values today if you want to, substantiate that. See who's buying up the property. Scientology has a little city block in Los Angeles, but they have an entire city in Florida, Clearwater, Florida, right up along the Gulf Coast, right up along the bay that many mystics will tell you is potentially the capital city. Atlantis, some old world empire, some old world metropolis. Frank Hamilton Cushing went down through Florida in the 1900s, early 1900s, and said, this is an empire on par with on the Maya, the Aztec. They just built out of shell. Much of it's washed away, and they crushed it all up and made road out of it. So, there's many reasons they'd lie. The springs, that's something you could talk about. The origin of mankind. You have discoveries such as the Vero man coming out of Florida. Vero man came out like 1910, 1915, around there, when Lucy and all these fraud, BS discoveries were coming out. They found a real one, and it was in Florida. And the state archaeologist or state geologist of Florida, Sellards, I forget his name, Sellards, championed the idea that man was in the Americas, Florida, 150,000 years ago. Well, and why was he saying that? Because they found human bones alongside mammals that they knew went extinct well past 13,000 years ago. And even if it were the very tail end of their existence in the Americas, you'd have to put them back farther than the Bering Strait theory. So they had to rethink everything. So they swept it under the rug. Sellards had to step down from his position. The hate was so extreme. This was like 19teens, 20s. And they found evidence that man had been in America. And there's been many discoveries since then. So that's another reason to lie. They have us fighting over the same desolate wasteland, right? We're exporting our faith. You know, it's one thing to export your resources and money, but to export your faith to a place that has no meaning. People are very, very, feel free to jump in.
No, this is good. Yeah.
Rambling.
Yeah. No, it's
But
good. What are some other what are some other things of evidence that have been found and covered up, or that you've sort of found that would point to this being, because it's, I mean, we love this topic, and it's hard to imagine that America has this much history, because really we've been sort of brainwashed. Like when I grew up, I mean, I didn't think the whole continent of North America had zero history, right? Except for the colonialism and all that, like the mainstream narrative. You know, you had to go to Egypt to look for anything sort of special. But it's
mhm.
so it's really interesting to start hearing about all this evidence coming out, and I mean, you've come across some real interesting things that really point to like very, very, very ancient stuff, like even pre Atlantis, right?
Yes.
What we
So here I'll pull up.
what we think of Atlantis.
Mhm. Yeah, I'll pull up something right here. If you guys want to see
Yep.
some,
Yeah, sure.
you know, tangible evidence that something was going on here thousands of years ago that the mainstream historians really have no understanding of whatsoever. So here we've got a folder here.
Okay.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah.
So these are what we call sacks or stones, named for the man who discovered them, realized their worth, realized their significance. And all across the earth, where you would expect to find ancient maritime cultures, you find evidence of ancient maritime cultures. The principle being because boats decay and, you know, get repurposed and people build out of wood and, you know, washes away, things sink, you guys get it. Well, you know what didn't go away? What they find time and time again, it's the telltale fingerprint of a maritime society. Stone anchors, ancient stone anchors, usually limestone, not always, but bored holes for rope to be fastened through them. And these on average would be about the size of a backpack, like you see there. Large enough for two men to throw over the side of a ship and large enough to pull back up, and ideally be able to pull up out of the water too, because sometimes you leave things like drogue stones in the water. We can get into that too. We'll spot the difference between a drogue stone, an anchor, a static anchor, and a ballast stone as well. But the reason I'm showing you this is we are not told that there was any substantial seafaring people in the Americas.
Yeah.
Now there might be, you know, I'm not taking credit away. I'm just saying that's what they'll tell you. But I recognize there's many tribes, many people out there who were seafaring. But in terms of empire, in terms of industry, we're told that's not the case. There are stones in Florida which directly contradict this, that show, yes, there was a great empire in the Americas. Their center point seems to have been Tampa Bay, Gulf of Mexico. Why? It's the most hospitable place in the world. You have 3 degrees of protection from the ocean. Florida is a natural breakwater. The Yucatan Peninsula is a natural breakwater. The Gulf of Mexico itself is substantially calmer than the Atlantic outside of it. Any fisherman in the Keys will tell you this. Go 5 minutes into the Atlantic and you hit chop.
Yeah.
Go 5 minutes into the Gulf and it's glass. It's almost always glass. And this is why they called it the Crystal Sea in ancient Greek mythology. And there's still today Crystal Beach and Indian Rocks Beach. That's what they call these anchors today. Indian rocks, because the Indians worshipped them. The subsequent Indians, natives, might not have had the ships, but they recognized the value of the rocks. They might have used them as mooring stones, but blah, blah, blah. This is a typical ancient stone anchor. You find these right where you'd expect to find them, where the Phoenicians were, around the Mediterranean, where ancient sailors in the Pacific were, Australasia, Polynesia. people with big boats who needed big anchors. And like I said, the typical weight here would be 50, 300 pounds.
And these are found mostly on the east coast of America.
Well, according to academia, these are found nowhere in America. These don't go with America. Now, these are found in the Mediterranean all the time. That's probably where this picture is from. They find some in the Bahamas. They do, but they're small. They find a bunch in Florida that they put in the museums and they label as anchors, but they're this big that you could fit in your hand. Any bigger than that, they won't place them in a museum. They won't acknowledge what they are because it opens a whole can of worms that is either going to, result in a lot of rewrites or uncomfortable press conferences and stuff like that. And this, I'll show you. I'm just showing the first picture here. We'll flip through and kind of see the magnitude of these. But yes, these are, Darren, these are in Florida, the ones we're going to be looking at. But what we're looking at right here is a typical one. And all around the earth, you find typical ones. The biggest ones you find are actually at the top of Mount Ararat, where Noah's Ark is said to have landed. But we'll connect that in a little bit. So this, you're going to see the ones in Florida are of extreme proportion. This is downtown St. Petersburg. Here. There we go. Downtown St. Petersburg. That's John Saxer there. He was printed in Ancient American magazine with, they had Bill Donato come out, an accredited archaeologist, come out and actually check out these anchors. I have footage of him detailing them in my Anchors of Atlantis documentary. And I've done 2 documentaries with John Saxer, if you want to see more on the stones. But Bill Donato clearly showed they have the rope marks that are indicative of anchors, ballasts, storm drogues. They have the patina showing, yes, 6,000, 7,000, if not more years old, at least. And consistent boring methods. Some people say, oh, that could be a solution hole. That's a erosion pattern or something like that, or that's a tree growing through it. None of those are true, but there are, some people have their theories about how the holes came about. Well, on some rocks, we can show without a doubt consistently sized boring. But you can't deny it. Some of these rocks, I'll show you here.
Does some of them have drill marks still, or
have been bored so clean, 2 feet through a boulder. You'll see here at the top. You see a little bit of a rope mark. Not sure if you can see my mouse, but
yeah, we can see it.
Rope mark there. This is
granite. What kind of rock is that?
The ones in Florida are about 90% limestone. They're all limestone. Like 90% of the rocks are limestone. Some of them, which shows that's a really, thank you for that question, Darren. It brings up a good point, because if these were a consistent weathering pattern that shows up like a perfectly bored rock, we wouldn't find it across different types of stone. Now, while most of these are limestone, like I said, 90%, if not more, across Florida are limestone, because that's what Florida's made of. You also find flint ones. They made them out of flint, if they had it. And they made them out of coral, too, which had to have been drilled. And you'll see some of these in the museums, but like I said, they're small. And then there's also...
What is the mainstream explanation for all these? Or did
they
you
don't
say they don't have
with,
one?
With the large ones, they don't talk. They will not acknowledge them.
Yeah.
With the small ones, I can show you. I'll have to pull it up.
Wouldn't they have been a long way from the ocean before the
sea level rise?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Tampa Bay, if you're going to look at sea level rise, Tampa Bay would have traced itself out along with that coastline out into the Gulf. However, modern day Tampa Bay, they believe, was a freshwater lake when you had that extra patch of land in the Gulf for Florida 7,000 years ago. That's a good point too. Is if we're talking Atlantis times, you would expect a deal of sea level change.
Can I show
Yeah,
my screen for a sec?
sure.
This is what I had up actually. While you're talking about Tampa Bay, I was just looking at. I love this this newer view of the layer on Google Earth or Google Maps here. Because
Mm,
look at this big. I mean, when if you're talking about the 300 or 400 feet after the flood, look, this would have all been that probably all would have been land, right? I mean, I don't know how
hmm.
deep this is right now, but I mean, look at how the shape of this whole area would have changed.
Yeah, that chunk off the left side of Florida certainly was poking out of the water. You had mammoths, you had mammoth bones and things of that sort all across that left chunk right there. Now on the right, that's a little deceiving. That wouldn't have been poking out. The
Oh, right.
Bahamas,
This ridge here.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that would have been still underwater. But you have the Bahamas would have been some more substantial uh, sized islands, but also um, Cuba would have made quite the impressive mountain range, and perhaps you would have only had a narrow band of entry into the Gulf, which would actually, in this case, make it
Right.
more advantageous from a
Right.
naval perspective.
Right here, even
And
just in there, you mean, right? Yeah.
precisely, yeah.
Yeah.
And you've got your ditch right there. What do they call that? The Cayman Channel or whatever. The ditch right there. That's very deep. That Cayman Channel.
Wow.
Yeah, I think that's. I don't know what they call it, but
Yeah. Yeah.
that's very deep. Could be terraformed. That's not really my territory, but what you've got is, I've talked about some of the symbolism with the Q, and yeah, that's the breadbasket right there, Tampa Bay, and that little peninsula right there is called Pinellas Peninsula. Pinellas Peninsula. I've actually theorized that it's named for the pineal gland because it's
Yeah.
shaped like the pineal gland. If you rotate it 90 degrees, it's precisely. And it used to be called Pinal before it was Pinellas. But
Okay, we're
yeah,
back to yours now. Yeah, thanks. I just wanted you to mention that while I had the map up.
sure. We've got here, not sure if this is a video, just a picture. This is one of the holes. That's just a little clump of dirt, but this is a perfectly bored hole. Perfectly. This is like drilled. There's no other way to say it. The lips coming into the hole are crisp. It's just a clean bore. No other way to say it. And if we look
Maybe they
at
were
the other,
tying airships too.
that's a good. No, that's a. I don't think that's what they were used for, but Florida was like the airship capital of America. Um, Opelika, Florida, which is a Moorish city, top to bottom, had a airport, a skyport on it, and believe it or not, the Nazis were touching down the Graf Zeppelin. The Graf Zeppelin was landing there regularly in Opelika, Florida, and they were buddies with the Seminoles. So the Seminoles have a. Sorry, you're looking at a blank screen here, but
No, that's okay.
so this rock, if we look at the other side, you can see it bored clean through the other side.
You can see pretty hard, pretty big marks there.
It
Circular marks
almost looks like tooling marks too.
Yeah.
You're right, like a rifle bore. And here's a substantial one. We call this one the sand dollar. This is the same exact size and shape arrangement of the holes, ratio of how thick it is, like a sand dollar. You find this in museums all the time, where they were pulling canoes up like this or tying off their canoes. each of those holes would have a rope. And what that would do, having two holes on a single anchor, would allow the people in the ship above to shimmy it loose in the chance that it got stuck. So you'll see people still do this today with stone anchors, but they're just not as prevalent.
And being able to maybe have a bigger one too, with two people pulling on it, so that, you know, you might have, if the ships get bigger, then you need bigger anchors probably.
Yes. Now, another side of this is, you know, probably where this is archaeology. You know, you show people the rocks, you show their function. There's not much to argue with. But then they say, well, these are too big. These are simply too big. And that's kind of where Bill Donato stepped away. Was Bill Donato, who was an accredited archaeologist looking for evidence of Bimini, Atlantis and Bimini. He used a lot of these pictures, not these stones. He took his own pictures like 20 years ago. But they showed that these were the largest stone anchors in the world. But then he said, well, this isn't Atlantis. He was like, Atlantis, they might have been tall. He's like, they weren't this big. They weren't this tall. He's like, no one could have done these. So he just shelved it. And he came all the way there to look at them. And he happily presented these pictures in his presentation as evidence that Atlantis was close to Bimini. But then when it came to it, explaining them in Florida, he just never really cared. And that's where John Saxer comes in. That's why they're called the Saxer Stones. After him, he's the only person who cared about these enough. There's another picture. That's one of the largest ones. And all of these show a rope mark hugging one side of the hole, if that makes sense.
Yep,
So in terms of mooring stones, could these have been used as mooring stones by smaller people later? Sure, they could have. But where most of these were dredged out of showed they were underwater or close to water, and then the sea level crept up on them. So these are always by the water. Many of these come from the east coast of Florida. Much of the stone comes from the east coast. So someone had to bring them there, and they look like anchors. So they must be. They don't just
from the east coast to the west coast.
Yes, many of these anchors were crafted from stone on the east coast of Florida. Formations on the east coast of Florida don't exist on the west coast, but we find them scattered across the west coast. So these stone anchors like this, Saxer stones, you'll find them with the highest concentration in Tampa Bay. But being indicative of an Atlantean empire in the Caribbean, which is precisely what Edgar Casey tells us, which is precisely what everybody tells us if we know how to decipher the information, it all points to the Gulf of Mexico. It's the circle protected. It's a series of bays protected within each other. You have the Gulf of Mexico, then you have Tampa Bay within that. Then within Tampa Bay, there is a series of other bays. So you have the lands, the zones of water and the zones of land. Dennis Brooks caught on to this. He didn't know anything about the anchors. Dennis Brooks is an author out of Hawaii or something. He might be a Tampa guy. He wrote a whole book on Tampa being Atlantis because he studied the waterways and he studied the engineering of the city. And he said, well, the Army Corps of Engineers didn't cut those substantial canals. And then he looked at the intracoastal waterway of Florida, which is an intelligently carved out waterway that was originally freshwater that buffered the mainland from the ocean. And this is still here today. And it goes all the way from like Maine to Texas or Mexico. But the only place where it's completely concurrent or where it runs all the way around is Florida. And you find this description both in Plato and I think it's more fleshed out by someone after than Plato, but there was a canal or a great ditch. There was a protective ditch filled with water, a moat that covered a central peninsula. So blah blah blah. Florida's Atlantis. I'll box Graham Hancock if I have to. I don't care. You know, I'd love it if some of these people came and saw the stones, but all these people want to say, "Oh, Atlantis is over here. It's over here." Well, everyone's focused on the city. No one can show me a smidge of the empire, a smidge of the fleet. This is a naval fleet we're talking about, right? Not Troy, not. I don't see people digging in the sand for Atlantis. So unless people are going to show me anchors, boats, which we have substantially in Florida, evidence of ancient, large arc ships that precisely would have taken the Gulf Stream across the Atlantic, right where everyone agrees they landed, around Mount Ararat, and we have a cultural diffusion thereon from 10,000, 6,000 years ago, depending who you ask, out of Central Asia. Well, what happened before that? Yes, everything after that happened in Eurasia. But is anybody going to analyze the discrepancies in the time and the navigational capacity of, you know, the ship they made and all this stuff? Why did it take 150 days for? And I'll stop here. If we're going to interpret any of this literally, then it has to hit every box. It has to check every box. I'm all about allegory. I'm all about metaphor. You know, I'm into it. Garden of Eden, you know, does it have to be a garden? No. But how many people around the world believe this is a tangible, physical garden? And they cannot show you a smidge to prove it, right?
So is your theory then kind of like that some of this stuff maybe in North America, like Florida, and maybe South America was first, like some of the more ancient stuff, and then after the flood, or maybe even before the flood, but then it moved east as well? Like, is that kind of like, are you flipping kind of the whole timeline on its head?
It's not like a narcissistic, like, hey, over here, like, look at,
no.
Where's our credit? But I'll tell you this: the way that they won't give the credit due to the Western Hemisphere, the way that all of history has been allocated to a small section in the East, tells me that yes, it probably was original. If we look to the work of E. Calloway, Florida's 1936 Republican candidate for governor, he said, when you look at the mummies of Mexico, they're not mummified. They're just buried bare. When you look at the stonework of many of the finest masonry structures in the Americas, they're of soft stone. These were not hard stone workers, at least not generally. So what does this tell us? What does this tell us? These things were done perhaps before man learned the art of embalming and mummification, before man learned the working of harder stones and metals. And perhaps it took, you know, a shuffling of the cards and a shifting of culture from the west to the east to accomplish those things. But since we have certain ages showing up in the archaeological record in Mesopotamia, our mainstream academia is hyper-focused on that. They're not giving the due to the Americas, and really the anchors show this. The bones, like Vero Man. Vero means truth, by the way. It's a city in Florida. Vero Man shows this.
So let's shift gears a little bit to you mentioned the Finnish, the Phoenicians, and all that, and we had Jim Chestner on about the Box Saga, like in, I think it was episode 206. So it was a couple 6-7 years ago, maybe. Is that sort of the Box Saga is what you're talking about?
Well, you know,
does it fit with that?
It does fit with it. Now, I'm a lover of the Box Saga. I've read the Box Saga. I've heard it. I'm a believer in much of it. I think it's probably the greatest well reserve reservoir of phonetic linguistic truth and wordplay, and that's one of my main things. And so yes, I'm a big supporter of it. However, I will have to disclaim the Bach Saga, lover. I'm filling in a lot of these gaps myself. I don't reference the Bach Saga when I'm making a theory or anything, but where I really sunk my teeth into was the Bach Saga places an extraordinary emphasis on the Gulf of Mexico. Extraordinary. With the Gulf Stream. They say that all of the change that kind of triggered the salvation of mankind was the Gulf Stream. And as they put it, a warm flow of water, intelligently, divinely guided water that goes from the Gulf of Mexico up to Europe, up, slips around into the Gulf of Finland, and then voila, it kept a small pocket of Europe melted through the Ice Age. So yes, now they kind of take that and fill in a lot of gaps with Eurasia. Another thing that the Bach Saga will tell you is that much of the record, if not all the record, of what transpired in the Americas after the Ice Age was lost, not only to the mainstream, but also to the oral folk traditionists like the Bach family. So
compared to European or Eastern Asia, compared to that, because it was so damaging in North America, like it was lost because of like physical damage.
Yes, that all record was lost because the empires that dwelled here were reduced to nothing, and their people perhaps were allowed to reproduce and repopulate, but there was no chance for the information to persist. Now, granted, I'm not like a Central American wisdom keeper, so maybe those guys have some good stuff.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. But I mean, even if the ice sheets weren't like covering all of North America, the flood definitely destroyed the lower part as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, according to the Bach Saga, all of the Northern Hemisphere, most of it was frozen very rapidly, and much of it died, ceased to exist. Whereas they kind of vaguely say the 10 tropical kingdoms were there after the Ice Age. So that means different groups of people had to survive in different pockets, different areas around in south of the equator. I'm assuming that might not be the case, but south of the ice for sure is where you had pockets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And them coming down, the Finnish coming down to those 10 kingdoms or whatever, it's also in a lot of the myths of those kingdoms that the people came down from the north, right? The northern from Hyperborea or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You've got books like Arctic Home of the Vedas showing not only everyone knows that Aryan culture came into India from the north, but not many people are willing to admit that it was the Arctic North. And that some of the features you find, the Viracocha, right, showing up in Peru, these ambiguously, Arctic people, Arctic, showing up with Arctic features, blonde, light skin, light hair, light eyes. And you get this in many different places. Now, is this an empire numbering in the thousands showing up? No, we never find that. And not unless we're talking about like the Eurasian steppe or, sea battles or things like that. But in these various seedings of civilization in different continents, you have a few teachers, a few people show up bearded, emblematic of the sun sometimes because of their coloring, where they came from, the east, often coming from the east to the west, or if they're in the west, people coming from blah blah blah. But yeah, I love the Bach Saga, And I hope I can fill in any gaps with Florida and some of the stuff I do, because, you know, Eeyore, I don't think he knew that Lake Worth, Florida, where the Gulf Stream comes closest to land today, to this day, has the most Finnish people outside of Finland.
Wow, that's interesting.
So Lake Worth, Florida is where the Gulf Stream comes closest to the mainland of America. And that's
Wow.
why Donald Trump lives right there. That's in a Moorish palace. That's why you have different people living right there where the Gulf Stream scrapes up. That's the good energy.
Whereabouts is that on compared to, like, what's another city that is close to that I can
Palm
see on the
Beach.
map?
So Palm Beach Island is east up against the ocean. West Palm Beach is across a lake, across the intercoastal. That lake is called Lake Worth. If you follow Lake Worth down a little bit, you get to a city, Lake Worth, that's also pressed up against Palm Beach. And this is where the Gulf Stream comes closest to land. So a little south of there, you'll find Gulf Stream, Florida. Gulf Stream, Florida, in between Delray and Boynton, just south of there.
Right.
You have Gulf Stream, Florida.
Interesting.
So, and what are the richest people on Earth today drive around and fly around in? They're Gulfstream jets. They're GSs.
Yeah.
So it's a time-old tradition.
So do you think, what about the part where the Finnish were, like, they started out dark, and I guess they lived in the north, in the Arctic, for so long they ended up white and blonde hair, blue eyes. I just heard that today. I was watching like a video that you had put an intro to, and it sounded like the Box Saga to me. It sounded like some of those Box Saga guys. It's been so long. It's been like 6 or 7 years since I read the book, so I can't remember all the details. And I wasn't really even ready for that back then. Like I couldn't really wrap my head around it all. But now, after talking about this for so many years, it's like it sort of makes sense. There's all the, like, there's the Agartha and the Hyperborea and the
Yeah, I've got some for you.
I mean,
You've got your Assyria, Arthur, Sumeria, Suomi. That's what the Finnish call themselves. That's one of my number one kickbacks, or not kickback, that people push back on, as they say, oh well, the Finnish don't even call themselves Finnish, and the Phoenicians didn't call themselves Phoenicians, so you're just grasping at straws, even though that word is the same meaning, fine goods. Right, fine goods. But what you have is the Finnish call themselves what? Suomi. That means swampy, right? Anyone ever heard of Swami Vivekananda? Right, the teachers from the north. Teacher, Swami, means you're Finnish, right? You finished school, you're graduated, right? So Suomi is where we get Sumeria. Suomi, Aryan, Suomi, Sumeria. And nearby, you have your Assyrians with their big beards, Arctic, suited for the Arctic, not for the hot desert, right? Beards don't come from the hot desert. Beards come from lumberjack territory, up near where it's cold. We need to warm the face. Now, you asked a good question. Another thing I get pushed back on is, in the Box Saga, it's not me. I champion the Box Saga the best I can. You have people saying, well, are you promoting evolution? Like, did people just get pushed up into the ice and they evolved and they had no say in the matter? No, I don't think that's what happened either. I think the Box Saga kind of glosses over it and lets you fill in a little bit of the gaps, but scientifically, white people can't just move to Africa and turn black, right? Black people can't just move to Iceland and turn white. Now, 10 generations, you might be a little lighter. Now, what I think was happening, truly, is they were selective breeding themselves. Selectively breeding for traits that would be desirable in the winter. Now, if you're an evolutionist, you could say that this is, they just went to the ice, and the ones who had better traits kept reproducing at higher frequency or presenting themselves better at higher frequency. So you could have it that way. You could have it that we selectively breed dogs to have blue eyes and light coats all the time. You can do this with the human. You can selective breed all you want, but you can't create a new species. So
It also could be that the time frame is not even comprehensible to us. Like it could have been hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years, or so far back that real
yeah,
evolution, like evolution, might have taken place. Like I have a hard time with the evolution as it's sort of portrayed in the mainstream, but um, this is, I think we're talking, there could be longer periods, like all through for example, all through the last ice age. They could have been there through that whole thing.
yes. I also, something I differ with the I don't know if you could call it mainstream. It's not, certainly not mainstream, but like the consensus of Bach Saga thinking is that we're working with like a 50 million, time period at least. Well, I kind of shy away from that, or I
Oh,
don't necessarily buy into that in a wholly literal sense. I think changes might have been occurring, and I think you have a folk preserved family oral tradition passed down through the family. How many characters have been, for example, you watch an ESPN movie, or you watch a movie that's trying to do justice to real life, and they can't. You have to make multiple, where there are four guys helping solve a crime. Oh well, we can, let's make it one character, and we'll give them all those guys' best qualities, right? Some things are done for the sake of brevity, for the sake of, what do they call it? Mnemonic like devices where they're speaking in a certain order, so certain things might be more conducive to how the story's told rather than how the history actually occurred. And I'm not trying to undermine the Bach Saga. I'm just saying I have a hard time, truly coming to grips with the 50 million year timeline. And the way that they explain it, which is convenient, is that they say evolved intelligent man on this earth, however long he lived here, up until Ragnarok, or one of them, every single human was cremated. That's why you don't find anatomically correct humans back past a certain point in the fossil record, because they were all cremated. You could also look at it the same way today. They say chimpanzees. You know how many chimpanzees they found fossilized ever? It's like 5, not even.
and they're not
Because they
cremating
just
themselves.
exactly. So either those things are new on the Earth, or their habitat just simply doesn't make fossils.
Yeah.
Or, which is true for many of the places humans live. Who knows? But yeah.
Well, I mean, I like how Tolkien took a lot of that Finnish, and I mean, I get mixed up in Norse and Finnish. Like I don't really, I always think they're the same thing, but I don't think they are. But Tolkien really seemed to pull a lot of that mythology into. I think that's why fantasy, in general, the whole genre, Tolkien especially, resonates with so many people, because he's talking about, species of, or I guess maybe races or species, I don't know how you want to call it, but dwarves and elves
Right.
and giants and all that magic. I mean, all that stuff was in a time, it's in our sort of genetic memory from a time long gone, that's why it really resonates with us.
Do you want to get into giants a little quick here?
Yeah, sure.
I've got here another file. So we're looking at some big anchors, right? And
Yeah.
those might leave more question marks than answers looking at stones like that. Well, if those were actually used, had a utility to them, it'd have to be big people.
Right.
People like you and I, unless we had some type of, chanting, cymatic frequency tech that could lift these things up, and I'd assume they'd be shaped better if that were the case. These were just big people. Now, in Florida, we find a lot of evidence of large, large people. Now, this evidence comes to us in the form of newspaper articles from about 1850 to 1950, were littered with stories of giant skeletons. Now, the mainstream will have you believe that these were all hoaxes. Every single one of them a hoax across the board.
We're only talking about a large human that's 7'5" or something like that.
Right. Now, giant is, I use giant loosely. Thank you for clearing that up. We're describing the natives of Florida they towered over the Europeans. We know this for a fact. But the conquistadors were not that tall, but the natives of Florida towered above them about 1.5 feet on average.
Wow.
Yeah, tall. Well over 6 feet is the minimum, the bottom end of how tall these guys were. And that's across the board in Florida. The Tocobaga tribe, coming out of Tampa Bay, was said to have been 7 feet. The Timucua out of St. Augustine area, Jekyll Island, you know.
Yeah.
That tribe who was doing sacrifice on some of those Jekyll Island altars, they were 8.5 feet tall. I mean, big, tall, muscular. These were not lanky freaks. These were athletic warriors. They were orators. They were great orators, the Spanish even say. Some of these giants gave speeches for 10 minutes that left the Spaniards in tears. I swear to God, they say this. So they weren't brutes. They weren't freaks. They weren't circus freaks. They were esteemed leaders, philosophers, and you'd expect these people to be crafting things. And they had big ships. I can show you the wood. I can show you where some might have landed, where some might have been built. You know, I can't show you a ship, but we have the wood. We have some of the most buoyant wood in the world. And what is it called? The gopher wood. Gopher wood. That's a transliteration, not a translation from the Bible. Meaning gopher is not used in Hebrew, but it's in the original Bible. Aramaic, Hebrew, gopher or kopher. That had no translation in English. It had no meaning in Hebrew. They don't know what tree it is. The word gopher is never used in Hebrew again. And then what do you have? Gopher wood, the real tree, grows in Florida. Gopher wood. It grows in Florida where? Along a patch of land that is precisely orientated as the 4 rivers of Eden that were described to us in Genesis. But blah, blah, blah. What else do we have in Genesis? In the book of the generations of Adam, you have Genesis 6:4, I think. There was giants on the earth in those days, right?
Yeah.
Mighty men of renown, whatever it says. Well, you get articles like this coming out of not just the Tampa Bay area, all across Florida.
So they're talking about big too, right? Not just 7'5", but like 15 feet, right? Sometimes even more, 15 feet, 20, 18 feet.
This one's 9. I think the biggest I've got in these articles that's like substantiated that I take to the bank is like 13 feet.
Okay, still. But I mean, they would have to have big boats too, just for these big people, right? I mean,
I think a 9-footer or a 13-footer could pass around that rock, those rocks we were looking at.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be easy, but it would be like me and you picking up a fridge. We could do it, you know.
Yeah. That's fascinating. So do you think that the giant thing is always fascinating because it seems to be there's so much evidence, but not enough to tip the scales or not enough for people to admit it. Like, do you think people, because there's all these pictures that people see too, like, do you think this is something that could crack things open if somebody like found, I mean, because you wonder why you're not allowed to go into the mounds anymore, right?
Yeah, you bring up a good point. Now, I put a lot of hard work into videos, and I can tell when one's gonna do good, right?
Right.
As best as a creator can. I know when a video deserves. You want to know the one video that I've put most effort into that got the least return. Not that,
Giants.
not monetary or anything, but just
Yeah. The shadow
yeah,
band, the worst almost. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank you. That's how I should put it. Shadow band. I don't know why. I don't know what in it. I think I went after the Smithsonian a little too hard in that one. But that's has to be my most shadow banned video is the
The Giants.
Giants
Yeah.
in Florida, because it's conclusive proof. It's not just the articles. There's pictures. It's the accounts of every European that landed in the 1500s said they were tall as hell, scary. Not only that, the bows they used were thicker than a man's wrist.
The bows.
Right? The bows they were using
Wow.
were thicker than the wrists of the men
Wow.
that they were going up against. They could shoot a bow accurately 200 yards on a rope, like not arced, not
Yeah.
not arched or arced, but they could throw an atlatl straight through a horse. You had this happening regularly in the DeSoto expeditions. The DeSoto expeditions, they make no mention whatsoever of mermaids, sea monsters, any of this nonsense. You know what they do clearly, plainly report? Chief Tuscaloosa standing 10 feet tall, being as tall at the waist as the men, the Europeans. And not just that, all the Spanish people were short. The natives were tall, but here's a picture. Now you're probably, you could say, well, we don't have scale here, but people say, where are the bones? Well, most of them went to the Smithsonian, so you probably can't expect them, in your lap anytime soon. But we do have them in picture, precisely where they were found. No hoaxing, none of this. This was common business back in the 1920s, 1900s. They were what's it called? Digging up the mounds to build roads, to fill roads with. And what they were doing was bumping into giant skeletons like every month.
No wonder why we're not allowed to go into the mounds anymore. I mean, that's really
Exactly. Now you understand why there's this like pseudo spiritual consideration that's especially set aside for one group of people on the earth. Egypt, they tear everything up themselves. They pull it all up right out of the ground. They want to see it. You go to Thailand, they dig it up. They want to see it. But Native Americans, the ones who conveniently were bought out with all the casinos and all that stuff, they're the ones who won't allow any genetic testing on the ancient sites. Why? Because a lot of that genetic testing would probably show that they don't have the rights.
Right.
Not that anyone has rights to land. I don't think like that, but that their whole existence in some of the establishments is a lie. Because
the whole colonialism thing has to stay. That whole narrative has to stay. That's why that's one of the reasons at the beginning when you were talking about why they lie. That's also a factor. They need this victim sort of mentality to keep going here. They keep having to demonize certain groups of people. So what do you think about what was I going to ask you about the Giants and about the mainstream still kept like quiet about that though back then even. So for some reason, like I know a lot of these newspapers reported it, but I narrated a mainstream scientific work on the prehistoric races, and they talk a lot about the mounds and a lot about Central America and like the Aztecs and the Mayans and they just wouldn't mention they had like 100 pages in them on the mounds and they just wouldn't mention the Giants. They just stayed away completely from that. And to me, it seemed like they talked. It was interesting from a perspective where the ruins and those lost civilizations, like they really said how prevalent those were. So there was some stuff that they seemed to be like, okay, admitting there's a huge mystery here and it needs more investigation, but they definitely wouldn't talk about the Giants. So
Yeah, I
the
think
cover up
that
must have been going for a while.
the giants open up so many can of worms. Not only because you know giants only get giants don't get big off of normal human food, right? We'll just start right there. So they're either blood drinkers, magicians, or tapping into some type of energy that we don't have access to today. So any one of those is an uncomfortable conversation for the mainstream academics. Number two, it shows clearly that mankind did not go upright from an ape to
Yeah.
where we are now at like 6 feet. If you're lucky, 6 feet up tall is like the new standard. Well, that's like a nice little Verizon bar, staircase going up, which is how they like to show it. Even though there's evidence that Homo erectus could have been, up to 8 feet tall. Neanderthal could have been up to 8 feet tall. Any of these guys could have been up to 8 feet tall. Excuse me, I gotta blow my nose here.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I think I think it's more about this. I think it's more of a spiritual
Yes.
suppression in a lot of ways. I really don't think they want us to realize how much powers we have, how much, like, if we were really worked on our shit and weren't distracted, that we could manifest our own reality, kind of have the superpowers, like you're talking about the giants there with magic. I mean, I really do think it all comes down to like just keeping us spiritually impotent, to be honest.
Hmm. Yeah, and there is magic to this. Like I said, I'm working on this video about the hurricane protection blessing of Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay has been spared every major hurricane of the last 100 years, whereas Fort Myers and places just south of it get pummeled like year after year. And the difference there is that the Tocobaga lived in Tampa Bay. And they were said to be peaceful. They were said to have been more friendly, had more kind of palatable religious rites, whereas the other tribes were very, what would you say, depraved, carnal, things like that. So the Tocobaga were virtuous. They lived in Tampa Bay. They had the best territory, the best real estate in Florida, and they were possibly the tallest. Spanish said they were 7 feet tall, and their mounds, their middens, their burial grounds are what people point to today as the evidence, as they point to that and say, this is what keeps Tampa Bay safe from the hurricanes that come to Florida every year.
Wow.
So whether that's the giants, there's lots of different reasons there why, but giants is part of that. Because
Is there people that like actually practice some prayer over at prayer now and meditation on that?
I've gone to some of these mounds. We organize like meetups at some of these. We don't get that woo woo yet with it, but we're going to. I know at places like the Miami Circle, they have tribes come out from all over to come and do events there, but I don't know about Tampa Bay.
What else you got coming up in the future? What else are you working on?
So there's an electrotherapy museum just north of here, like real old world antiquitech machines. I went there, filmed a bunch of crazy shit.
Wow.
With electrotherapy, like we got electrocuted, our hair stood up, and that was just like the most basic thing. Tons and tons of cool stuff there. And I was doing a video with Devon, the Black Airbender out of Miami, and I'm showing how today he's centered in Florida. He's kind of like the forefront of the electro culture, I don't know, breathwork realm right now.
Wow.
Electropuncture is what I filmed, where they were putting acupuncture needles, and then shooting a plasma arc right into it, like you see the bolt of electricity going from the gun into the person's third eye.
Wow.
And then we filmed that, and then we went to the electrotherapy museum and looked at like the old style machines that were almost doing the same thing. And then if anyone caught there's a very special property in Miami with a cave on it. I think a lot of people caught that video. The portal, El Portal.
Okay.
Well, we're gonna be doing a follow-up video to that coming soon, but
Cool.
that's what I'm working on. That's what I'm working on
Cool.
right now.
Did you do they have anything on electroculture there as well, or just electropuncture?
Yes, a little bit. That wasn't like his forte,
Okay.
but the museum was electrotherapy. But
Yeah.
Devon's into electroculture for sure.
I wanted to tell you, we narrated, we have this audiobook available on our podcast, Adult Brain Audiobooks podcast. It's the original electrocultural book from the early 1900s from Crystal Flow. Yeah, pretty interesting. I mean, it seems like they were really making progress back then, and then just it disappeared, you know? I wanted to quickly show you another book too, because I know you like the language thing and all that. We got a book here that did pretty well. It's from Alvin Boyd Kuhn as well, and it's called The Esoteric Structure of the Alphabet. Where is it? I'm not going to be able to find it because this always happens. I'll probably go over it like 5 times and miss it. Here it is. It's really, really interesting. He talks about like all these phonetic things and these alphabets all coming from the same source. You might find that super interesting as a quick little read. And it's also on the podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How much longer we got going?
That's it. We can wrap up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks, buddy. Is there anything? How can people get a hold of you? How can people find your work and all that?
Well, Old World Florida on YouTube, Old World Florida on Instagram. I've got a Twitter. I don't know, it's something like that, Old World FL or.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's it. Thank you for having me, Graham.
Yeah, right on, buddy. That was fun. Yeah.
Say goodnight to Darren for me. But
will do. Thanks, buddy. We'll do it again sometime. You're welcome back anytime.
For sure, man. Thanks for having me.
See ya.
Good night.
I'm going to end the stream here too.
Okay,
everybody.
cool.